Alara kept her head down, her world reduced to the soft scrape of the polishing cloth against silver. Each candelabra was a monstrosity of twisting, ornate metal, heavy enough to break her wrist. The great hall was a cavern of sound and light, a place she was meant to occupy only as a shadow. Laughter, sharp and glittering as the jewels on the ladies' throats, echoed from the vaulted ceilings painted with forgotten constellations. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and spiced wine, was a suffocating blanket she was not meant to breathe. She was a ghost at this feast of fates, a necessary but invisible cog in the grand machinery of the choosing ceremony. Her dress was borrowed, a drab gray thing that had been mended twice at the seams. It was clean, but it smelled of lye soap, not jasmine and rosewater like the gowns that swept past her, rustling like autumn leaves made of silk. Her focus remained on the silver, on the rhythmic motion of her hand. If she concentrated on the task, she could almost ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She could almost forget that the single piece of dry bread she had eaten before dawn was meant to last her until this entire charade was over. The ceremony was a centuries-old tradition. Once in a generation, when the Alpha King remained without a mate, the eligible daughters of all the great houses were presented. It was a political meat market dressed in finery, a delicate dance of power and alliance, where the prize was a seat beside the most powerful wolf in the known world. The council, a collection of gray-bearded men whose faces were etched with the permanent scowl of self-importance, had been urging the king for months. "The kingdom needs a Luna," they had insisted. "The lineage must be secured." Alara had heard the whispers in the servants' corridors. King Kalen was old, they said, ancient even, though he wore the face of a man in his prime. He had ruled for over 200 years, a stoic and unshakable mountain of a monarch. He had seen empires rise and fall, had outlived every friend and contemporary. He was a legend, a creature of ice and shadow whose rare appearances struck fear and awe into the hearts of his subjects. And today, he was meant to choose a wife. A swirl of crimson silk caught her eye. Lady Seraphina, daughter of the powerful Lord Valerius, preened near the central hearth, her laughter the loudest and sharpest in the room. She was considered the foremost candidate, a perfect specimen of high-born breeding. Her hair was the color of spun gold, her eyes a startling sapphire blue, and her smile was a weapon she wielded with practiced ease. Alara had known Seraphina since they were children, back when Alara's family still had a name, before sickness and debt had stolen everything from them. Seraphina had not been kind then, and power had only sharpened her cruelty. As if summoned by the thought, Seraphina turned, her gaze sweeping the room with casual disdain. Her eyes, like chips of ice, landed on Alara. A slow, malicious smile spread across her perfect lips. She drifted from her circle of admirers, her movements fluid and predatory, a lioness singling out a field mouse. Alara's heart began to beat a little faster. She tried to make herself smaller, to blend into the tapestry behind her, but it was too late. She had been seen. "Still polishing the silver, Alara?" Seraphina's voice was honey-sweet, but with an underlying note of pure acid. She stopped directly in front of the candelabra, blocking Alara's escape. "Some of us are born to hold scepters. Others, it seems, are born to polish them." Alara did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on a swirl of silver that resembled a snarling wolf. "My lady," she murmured, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Look at me when I speak to you," Seraphina commanded, her tone dropping the pretense of sweetness. Alara slowly, reluctantly lifted her head. She met the sapphire gaze, her own brown eyes carefully blank. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of her fear. Seraphina's smile tightened. She gestured vaguely with a hand laden with rings. My father was just remarking on your family's account. The debt grows ever larger. One must wonder how you ever intend to repay it. Will you be scrubbing floors until your hair is as gray as your dress? The public humiliation was a physical blow. Heat flooded Alara's cheeks, a painful, burning tide. The nobles closest to them had fallen silent, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. This was sport to them. A moment's diversion before the king arrived. Alara's hands clenched on the polishing cloth, her knuckles white. She thought of her younger brother, his cough still weak, and the medicine her meager earnings barely afforded. Was a small movement. Almost was a small movement. Almost imperceptible. But it was a rebellion. She would not crumble. She would not cry. She had weathered worse storms than Seraphina's petty cruelty. I will honor my family's debt, my lady, she said, her voice quiet but steady. There was a flicker of defiance in her gaze, a spark in the brown depths that Seraphina had not expected. For a moment, Seraphina looked taken aback. Then her face twisted into a mask of pure spite. With a flick of her wrist, she backhanded the heavy candelabra. It toppled from its pedestal, crashing onto the marble floor with a deafening clang. Silver polish splattered across the hem of Alara's worn dress and the toe of Seraphina's silk slipper. Clumsy fool! Seraphina shrieked, making a show of recoiling. You've ruined my shoes! You are utterly useless. She looked around at the assembled guests, playing to her audience. How can the palace employ such incompetence? Alara stared at the mess on the floor, the heavy, dented silver, the white smear on the pristine marble. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. This would come from her wages. It would take months to pay for the repair. Months where her brother would have less. The thought was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. But as she knelt to retrieve the heavy piece, her fingers brushing against the cold metal, a strange calm settled over her. She had survived. She would survive this too. She was a rock in a river of cruelty, worn smooth by the current but never washed away. Suddenly, a silence fell over the hall. It was not a quiet lull in conversation. It was a profound, absolute cessation of all sound. The laughter died. The whispers ceased. Even the rustle of silk seemed to be instantly stilled. It was a heavy, expectant silence, thick with a mixture of reverence and fear. Alara, still on her knees, felt a change in the very air, a drop in temperature, a sudden charge of electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The great oak doors at the far end of the hall swung inward, moved by an unseen force. They opened onto the dim corridor beyond, creating a stark, dark frame. And in that frame, a figure stood. He did not enter with a procession of guards or the fanfare of trumpets. He simply appeared. King Kalin. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulder, a silhouette of immense power against the light of the hall. He wore no crown, no jewels, no ostentatious robes of state. His attire was simple, almost severe, a tunic of the deepest black, tailored to perfection, and trousers tucked into high leather boots. A silver clasp in the shape of a snarling wolf's head held a dark gray cloak at his shoulder. That was his only adornment. It was all he needed. His presence was a crown, his stillness a declaration of absolute authority. He walked into the hall, and the nobles who lined his path bowed low, their heads bent in submission. They did not dare to meet his eyes. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his size, a predator in his own domain. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, handsome in a way that was more dangerous than beautiful. His dark hair was brushed back from a high forehead, and his expression was one of stoic neutrality, a mask carved from stone. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the color of a gathering storm, a swirling, turbulent gray that seemed to see everything, to strip away all pretense and lay souls bare. They were ancient eyes, filled with a weariness that warred with an unyielding strength. Ilara, still crouched on the floor, felt the force of his arrival like a physical blow. He was not just a king. He was a fundamental power of the world, like a thunderstorm or an earthquake. His gaze swept the room, dismissive and brief. It passed over the row of beautifully dressed candidates, including the perfectly poised Serafina, without a flicker of interest. It passed over the anxious faces of his councilmen, their lips pursed in anticipation. His storm-gray eyes scanned the assembled power and wealth of his kingdom and found it all wanting. And then his gaze stopped. It landed on her, on Ilara. A serving girl on her knees with a smudge of silver polish on her cheek and a ruined candelabra in her hands. She felt his eyes on her like a physical touch, a brand of heat that seared through her skin, straight to her very core. The air left her lungs in a silent gasp. For a dizzying, terrifying moment, the cavernous hall and its hundreds of occupants ceased to exist. There was only the king, and there was her. It was impossible. He was looking past her, surely. At the tapestry behind her, at a speck of dust on the pillar. But he was not. His focus was absolute, a hawk sighting its prey from a mile away. The world narrowed to the space between them. And in that space, something extraordinary happened. Ilara felt a pull, a strange, inexplicable tug deep within her chest. It was not a physical sensation, but something deeper, something that resonated in her soul. It was a thin, shimmering thread of warmth, stretching from her to him, a feeling of impossible, instantaneous recognition. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been. Her heart, which had been hammering with fear, gave a single, painful thud, and then seemed to stop altogether. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only stare into those storm-gray eyes and feel the undeniable truth of the connection that had just snapped into place between them. Ignoring the collective gasp of the court, ignoring the frantic, hissed whispers of his council, King Kalen began to walk. He did not walk towards the throne on its raised dais. He did not walk towards the line of hopeful Luna candidates. He walked in a straight, unwavering line directly towards her. The nobles scrambled to get out of his way. They parted for him like water breaking around the bow of a great ship, their faces a mask of confusion and shock. His eyes never left hers. With every step he took, the thread between them seemed to grow stronger, warmer, pulling taut. Ilara was frozen, trapped in his gaze, a butterfly pinned by the sheer intensity of his focus. He stopped less than a foot from her, looming over her small form. The entire kingdom held its breath. Up close, he was even more imposing. The scent of pine and cold mountain air clung to him. She could see the faint silver strands at his temples, the only hint of his true age. He looked down at her, at the dented candelabra she still clutched, at the polish staining her gray dress. His expression did not change, yet she felt as though he saw everything. He saw her poverty, her humiliation, her stubborn pride, the fierce, resilient spark she kept hidden deep inside. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble that vibrated through the marble floor, through the soles of her worn shoes, and up into her bones. It was a voice of ice and iron, of mountains and midnight. "What is your name?" The question was simple, direct. It was not a command, but it held the weight of one. For a heartbeat, her throat closed with fear. All she had ever been taught was to be invisible, to be silent. to never draw the attention of the great lords. And she had just drawn the attention of the greatest of them all. But beneath the fear was that stubborn core of defiance. She would not cower. Not entirely. She forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "Ilara, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He did not seem to see a servant. He did not seem to see the dirt on her cheek or the mended seams of her dress. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, as if he had been searching for her for a very, very long time. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, but he also saw the unyielding strength in her spine. A flicker of something, not amusement, but perhaps intrigue, respect, passed through his storm-gray eyes. Then, to the utter astonishment of every soul in the hall, he did something unthinkable. He knelt. The Alpha King, ruler of the 7 territories, a being of immense and ancient power, lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. The sound that ripped through the court was a collective, strangled gasp of disbelief. Seraphina's face went white with shock, her perfect mouth falling open. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently taking the ruined candelabra from her trembling fingers and setting it aside. Then, he extended that same hand to her, palm up, an offering, an invitation. "Stand with me, Ilara," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. Numbly, as if in a dream, she placed her small, work-roughened hand into his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and steady. The moment their skin touched, the thread of connection between them blazed into a brilliant, undeniable fire. It was a jolt of pure energy, a silent explosion of light and warmth that filled every empty, aching part of her. He felt it too. She saw it in the slight widening of his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He rose to his feet, drawing her up with him with effortless strength. He did not release her hand. Instead, he laced his fingers through hers, a possessive, protective gesture that sent another shockwave through the silent hall. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of his council, the open-mouthed disbelief of the noble ladies, and the pure, murderous rage on the face of Lady Seraphina. His voice rang out clear and absolute, each word a hammer blow against the stunned silence. "The choosing is over." He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Then he looked down at Ilara, his storm-gray eyes softening almost imperceptibly as they met hers. He lifted their joined hands slightly, a gesture for all to see. "I have made my choice." For a second, there was only utter silence. Then the dam of decorum broke, and the hall erupted into a chaotic flood of noise. Outraged whispers, confused murmurs, angry shouts. It was madness. "Impossible. A servant girl? He cannot be serious." Lord Valerius, Seraphina's father, shoved his way to the front, his face purple with indignation. "Your Majesty, this is an affront. She is a nobody." His face was a mask of grim disapproval. "My king," he began, his voice raspy with age and authority. "Kaelin, you must reconsider. The law, the traditions, they demand a Luna of high birth, one who can strengthen our alliances, not this." He gestured dismissively towards Ilara, as if she were a piece of dirt the king had mistakenly picked up. Ilara flinched, instinctively trying to pull her hand away, to shrink back into the shadows where she belonged, but Kaelin's grip was like iron. He held her fast, a silent anchor in the raging storm of the court's disapproval. Kaelin turned his head slowly to face the elder. The look in his eyes was not angry. It was far, far colder than that. It was the chilling, absolute cold of a winter so deep it freezes the very heart of the world. The hall fell silent once more, the nobles shrinking back from the sheer palpable menace radiating from their king. The law, Guan. Kalen's voice was deceptively soft, yet it carried to every corner of the hall. You would lecture me on the law? Let me remind you of the first law, the one upon which all others are built. He paused, his gaze pinning the old man in place. The Alpha King's choice is absolute. His word is final. He then looked out at the sea of hostile faces, his gaze sweeping over them with contempt. You speak of alliances and high birth. You see ledgers and bloodlines. You are blind. The bond does not care for station. The fates do not ask for a dowry. He looked down at Alara, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of raw emotion in his eyes, a fierce, possessive protectiveness that stole her breath. She is the one, he stated, not as a king making a decree, but as a man stating an undeniable, fundamental truth. My word is final. Without another glance at the sputtering council or the furious nobles, he turned, his hand still holding Alara's, and began to walk away from the throne. He led her towards a small, unassuming door set into the side of the hall, one she knew led to the quiet, private corridors of the royal wing. The crowd parted before them, a sea of silent, resentful faces. He pulled her into a small, richly appointed antechamber, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with a soft but definitive click. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the previous uproar. The room was lit by a single glowing crystal, casting a soft, warm light over walls lined with books and ancient maps. Kalen finally released her hand, and the loss of his warmth was immediate and startling. He walked to the center of the room, turning his back to her as he stared into the unlit fireplace. He seemed to be gathering himself, the rigid control he had displayed in the hall slipping just for a moment. He was still a mountain, but now she could see the faint cracks of weariness in the stone. Ilara stood by the door, her whole body trembling. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. This could not be real. It was a dream, a cruel, elaborate jest. Any moment now she would wake up on her thin straw pallet, the bell ringing to call her to the scullery. I will not force you, he said, his back still to her. His voice had lost its hard public edge. It was deeper now, quieter, laced with a thread of something she could not name. It might have been exhaustion. The bond chose us, Alara, but the path we walk from here, that choice is still yours. He turned to face her. The full force of his storm-gray eyes was on her again, but the coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, startling vulnerability. The mask was gone. She was seeing the man, not the king. For 2 centuries, I have sat on that throne and listened to the whispers of vipers and the plotting of fools, he said, his voice low and intense. I have been surrounded by people, yet I have been utterly alone. They see the crown, the power, the alpha. Not one of them has ever truly seen me. He took a step closer. Until you. He gestured back towards the door. They want a Luna who is a political pawn, a pretty broodmare to secure a bloodline. I have waited. I have waited for someone who was not impressed by the title, someone whose soul would recognize mine. He stopped before her, his gaze searching her face. The bond? You feel it, do you not? This pull between us, this rightness. Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She did feel it. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, undeniable fire in her veins. It was the most real thing she had ever felt in her life. I am offering you a choice, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You can walk out that door. I will see that your family's debt is cleared, and you will be given a home far from here, where no one will ever bother you again. I will give you your freedom. He paused, and the weight of his next words filled the small room. "Or you can stay. Stand with me. Be my Luna. Be my equal." He reached out, his fingers hovering just above her cheek. "I cannot promise you it will be easy. The court will hate you. They will try to break you. But I swear on my life, I will not let them harm you. You will never be invisible again." It was too much to comprehend. Freedom from debt, a home, a life without fear. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But the other offer, to stay, to stand beside this terrifying, lonely king who saw her in a way no one else ever had. It was a dream she had never dared to have. To be seen, to be valued, to be his. She thought of Seraphina's sneer, of the noble's scorn, of a life spent scrubbing floors and bowing her head. Then she thought of the warmth of his hand, the fierce protection in his eyes, and the blazing, undeniable connection that sang between them. One path was safety, the other was a terrifying leap into a fire. She lifted her chin, the tremor in her body finally ceasing. She met his gaze, her own brown eyes clear and resolved. "I will stay," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was the strongest sound she had ever made. A slow, breathtaking smile touched the Alpha King's lips. It transformed his harsh features, chasing away the shadows of centuries. And in that moment, Alara knew she had not just made a choice, she had accepted her destiny. The days that followed were a blur of silks and protocol. Ilara was moved from her tiny attic room to a suite of chambers so vast she could have fit her entire former life into the dressing room alone. Servants who had once ignored her now bowed and scraped, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentful curiosity. She was fitted for gowns made of starlight and velvet, taught the intricate etiquette of the royal court, and instructed on the history of the 7 territories. It was dizzying, overwhelming, a fairy tale with teeth. Kalen was a constant, steady presence. He ate his meals with her, not in the great hall, but in the quiet of her new sitting room. He would listen as she haltingly spoke of her life, of her brother, of the simple things she loved. He, in turn, told her of his own burdens, the crushing weight of his long reign, the solitude of his power. He never touched her, not beyond a formal hand at her elbow, but his eyes were always on her, a silent promise of the bond that hummed between them. The court, however, was a nest of vipers. Their acceptance was a thin veneer over a core of pure poison. They smiled to her face, their words like honey, but their eyes were cold and sharp. The whispers followed her everywhere. "The little mouse. The scullery queen. She'll be gone in a month." Seraphina and her father had been quiet since the choosing, too quiet. Ilara knew it was the calm before a storm. They were waiting, watching for a moment of weakness, a chance to strike. The moment came at the grand announcement feast. It was a formal affair meant to officially present Ilara to the foreign dignitaries and the ruling lords of the territories. The hall was even more splendid than it had been at the choosing, glittering with what seemed like 1,000,000 candles. Ilara sat beside Kalen at the high table, wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that shimmered with embroidered silver stars. She felt like an imposter, a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Kalen's hand rested near hers on the table, a silent reassurance, but the hundreds of eyes on her were a heavy weight. The meal was a tense, formal affair. Toasts were made, speeches were given. And through it all, Ilara could feel the malevolent glare of Lady Seraphina from a table across the hall. She was dressed in a gown of blood red, a stark challenge to Ilara's quiet blue. Her face was a beautiful, serene mask, but her eyes burned with a hateful fire. Just as the dessert course was being served, Seraphina stood. The hall, sensing drama, fell quiet. She held a crystal goblet of wine in her hand, her posture one of perfect aristocratic grace. "A toast," she said, her voice ringing out with chilling clarity. "To our new Luna." She smiled, a flash of white teeth that was anything but friendly. A woman of such surprising origins. She took a deliberate step away from her table, moving into the open space before the dais. All eyes were on her. "My king," she said, addressing Kaelin but never taking her venomous gaze from Alara. "You have spoken of the bond, of a connection of souls. It is a beautiful sentiment. But a kingdom is not built on sentiment. It is built on strength, on honor, on an impeccable foundation." She took another step closer. Ilara's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She could feel Kaelin tense beside her, a low, dangerous stillness entering his frame. "Surely," Seraphina continued, her voice dripping with false concern, "you cannot bind yourself, and this kingdom, to someone so tainted. Does your future Luna know the meaning of debt? Or is that a concept only familiar to those of us who have something of value to lose?" A shocked murmur rippled through the hall. This was a direct public challenge. It was high treason. But Seraphina was not done. She was a woman scorned, and she was burning her entire world down for revenge. She finally looked directly at Alara, her smile widening into a triumphant, cruel sneer. "Tell them, little mouse. Tell them how your family is in crippling debt to my father. Tell them how every meager coin you have ever earned has gone into his coffers. Tell them that you are not just a commoner." Her voice dropped to a dramatic, damning whisper that carried through the silent hall. "You are property. Bought and paid for. An indentured servant bound by contract. How can a woman who is owned by another ever rule as a queen?" The words struck Alara like a physical blow. The air was punched from her lungs. This was her deepest shame, the secret burden she had carried for years. She had been so careful to keep it hidden, to maintain her dignity despite the crushing weight of the debt. And now, Seraphina had laid it bare for the entire world to see, twisting it into the ugliest possible shape. The faces of the lords and ladies stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, contempt, and morbid fascination. She was a spectacle, a piece of gossip. Her deepest wound had become their evening's entertainment. The room began to spin, the candle flames blurring into streaks of light. She felt small, exposed, and utterly worthless. Kaelin did not move. He did not look at Seraphina. He did not look at the shocked faces of his court. His entire, absolute focus was on Alara. His storm-gray eyes searched hers, cutting through her panic and her shame. He saw the pain, the raw humiliation that threatened to shatter her. He saw the tears she refused to let fall. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. The scraping of his chair against the marble floor was the only sound in the dead silent hall. His immense height seemed to suck all the air from the room. He walked around the high table, his movements measured and lethal. He did not go toward Seraphina. He came to a stop directly behind Alara's chair. He placed his large, warm hands on her shoulders, a solid, unshakable wall of support. It was a clear public act of protection. He was shielding her with his own body, with his own power. Only then did he lift his head and turn his gaze upon Seraphina. The cold fury in his eyes was a terrifying thing to behold. It was not the hot, fleeting anger of a lesser man. It was the ancient, implacable wrath of a god. Seraphina's triumphant smirk faltered, her face paling under the sheer force of his silent rage. "Her debts?" Kaelin asked. His voice was not loud. It was a quiet, conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than any shout. You speak of the money your father, Lord Valerius, extorted from a desperate family in exchange for medicine that saved a child's life? He let that question hang in the air, allowing the ugly truth of it to sink in. Consider it paid. He then raised his voice, not in volume, but in power, addressing the entire silent assembly. You look at her and see a debtor, a commoner. He squeezed Alara's shoulders gently. I look at her and see a woman who was willing to sacrifice her own freedom, her own future, for the love of her family. You see weakness. I see a strength of heart that could hold up this entire kingdom. His gaze swept across the room, a king passing judgment. You value bloodlines and titles and bags of gold. You are fools. Her past does not matter. Her heart does. And her heart, he said, his voice dropping slightly, his eyes finding Alara's in the reflection of a silver platter, belongs to me, as mine belongs to her. He then turned his full, chilling attention back to Seraphina and her father, who was now sweating profusely. Lord Valerius, Kalin said, his voice dropping to ice, your predatory lending practices and your treasonous disrespect have earned you a swift reward. Your titles, your lands, and all your holdings are hereby forfeit to the crown. You will find that the king's Luna is not a target for your petty ambitions. He made a short, sharp gesture to the royal guard standing by the doors. Escort them to the black cells. They will await my judgment there. Seraphina let out a choked cry as the guards seized her and her father, their faces masks of utter disbelief and terror. They were dragged from the hall, their protests lost as the great doors slammed shut behind them. A new, deeper silence fell over the court. The viper had been defanged. The challenge had been met and utterly destroyed. Kalin turned back to Alara. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by a tenderness that made her heart ache. In front of the entire court, he knelt before her again. He took her hands, which were cold as ice, into his own. Alara, he murmured, his voice for her alone. You are not property. You are not a debt on a ledger. You are my world. My queen. He rose, gently pulling her to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, wiping away the single tear that had finally escaped. He ignored the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching them, the silent gasps of the dignitaries. The world fell away until it was only the two of them again, bound by a force stronger than any law or tradition. I see you, he whispered, a solemn vow. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was fierce and passionate, a conflagration of centuries of loneliness and a lifetime of being overlooked. It was a king sealing his choice, a man sealing his heart. It was a public declaration, more powerful than any decree, that she was his, and he was hers, and the rest of the world did not matter. When he finally broke the kiss, Alara was breathless, her face flushed, her shame washed away and replaced by a blazing, brilliant certainty. She was home. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall arched windows of the royal bedchamber, painting stripes of gold across the cool stone floor. Alara stirred, nestled in a cocoon of warmth and soft linen. A heavy arm was draped possessively over her waist, and the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart sounded against her back. She smiled, a soft, sleepy thing, and shifted, turning in Kalin's arms to face him. He was still asleep, a rare and precious sight. Sleep smoothed away the hard lines of the king, leaving only the man. The formidable monarch who could quell a rebellion with a single look was gone, replaced by someone peaceful, someone vulnerable. His dark hair was a mess against the white pillows, and a faint smile touched his lips, as if his dreams were pleasant for the first time in centuries. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He was no longer a terrifying legend to her. He was Kaelin. Her Kaelin. His eyes fluttered open, the storm-gray irises instantly finding hers, clear and filled with a deep, abiding affection that still made her breath catch. The smile on his lips widened. "Good morning, my queen," he rumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "You smell of sunshine." "And you," she whispered back, pressing a soft kiss to his shoulder. "Smell of pine trees and responsibility." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through her. Laughter came more easily to him now. The weariness that had clung to him like a shroud was gone, burned away by the warmth of their bond. He was still the powerful Alpha King, but he was no longer alone in his power. Later that day, Alara stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city. She was not dressed in silks and jewels, but in a simple, practical dress of forest green. Below, in the courtyard, a long line of people waited patiently. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, the ordinary people of the kingdom. They were not here to petition the king. They were here for the Luna's foundation. Using the vast wealth seized from Lord Valerius, Ilara had established a fund. It offered fair, interest-free loans to those facing hardship, paid for healers to travel to remote villages, and funded apprenticeships for orphans. She had taken the instrument of her deepest shame and forged it into a shield for her people. She was not just a consort, she was a queen in her own right, her power rooted not in bloodlines, but in compassion. The people, who had first been suspicious of the commoner queen, now adored her. They called her Ilara the Kind, the Queen of Hearts. A familiar warmth enveloped her from behind as Kaelin wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. He followed her gaze down to the courtyard. "Another busy day for the Foundation," he murmured, his voice filled with pride. "There is much to be done," she replied, leaning back against his solid chest. "Too many people have suffered under the greed of men like Valerius. And now they have a champion," he said softly. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You have given them hope, Ilara. You have given me hope." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the city bustle with life. The kingdom was changing. Under their joint rule, a new era of prosperity and justice was dawning. "Do you remember that night?" Kaelin's voice was a low murmur against her ear. "In the great hall, you were so small and fierce, kneeling on the floor with silver polish on your cheek." A smile touched her lips. "I remember a terrifying king who walked past 100 perfect ladies to find a servant hiding behind a pillar. I wasn't looking for perfection," he said, turning her in his arms to face him. He cupped her face, his storm-gray eyes tender and full of a love that was as vast and ancient as he was. "I was looking for you." He tilted his head. "I did not see a servant. I did not see dirt or poverty." "What did you see?" she whispered, her heart swelling. "I saw the stars that had been missing from my sky," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw my home." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers in a kiss that was no longer a claiming, but a promise of forever. A quiet, steadfast love that had healed a lonely king and empowered a woman the world had tried to keep invisible. Together, they were whole, and their kingdom was finally safe.